Jatin Nayak is our next speaker. And to introduce him, we have Vineet Gill. Yes, Vineet. Hi. So Vineet is a writer. I mean, he's been other things. He's also been in publishing. He's been an essayist and reviewer for various journals. He's written a wonderful and genuinely unusual biography, a literary biography or critical biography or whatever you want to call it, of the Hindi writer Nirmal Verma. And so the way he's worked with the essay and with translation Hindi, Nirmal Verma, I think makes him a great fit for Jatin's talk, for chairing Jatin's talk on the essay in Odia. So I'm handing it over to you, Vineet.
Thank you. Thanks, Amit. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me clearly? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amit, for that generous introduction, really. And thanks for organizing this series of symposia with such commitment. And at a time of rampant mainstreaming and total commercialization of culture, at least in this country, when we've completely run out of space to have any kind of conversation about literature and art and criticism. So I look forward to more such events and more works published under the literary activism rubric. Today we have with us Jatindra Kumar Nayak. He used to teach English literature at the Utkal University in Bhubaneswar, Odisha. And by the way, last night I was watching the news and I kept hearing Odisha when they said Odessa. They talked about Odessa throughout the news. Amit would appreciate this mishearing perhaps, but this makes me think about how to stay focused on aesthetic problems at a time when the world around might be going up in flames. Maybe the modernists have a thing or two to teach us about this, although most of them got their politics wrong. Mr. Nayak is a scholar and a critic and a translator. He's really made some wonderful translations from the Odia into English, bringing to the notice of the Anglophone reader this really rich and diverse literary tradition. And he's translated, among other things, he's co-translated the autobiography of the Odia writer Fakir Mohan Senapati, which may be the first autobiography ever written in Odia. And I've been reading excerpts of that, and I'm really struck by how intense and how moving it is. In parts, there's a scene about about Senapati being punished in school, ritual caning that used to happen at a school, and it really reminded me of Joyce's portrait of the artist as a young man. Both these books might be published around the same time. And maybe I'll share the pages with you, Mr. Nayak, from Joyce's book. There's a striking similarity between those caning scenes. Anyway, so Mr. Nayak is also a member of the English Advisory Board of the Sahitya Academy. And his latest book is Critical Discourses in Odia, which he's co-edited. Today, he'll be speaking about the emergence of the essay in Odia literature, which is a topic of great interest to me. And before we begin, I think we should remind ourselves that the essay has always thrived on the margins of culture. It has resisted easy categorization into temporal or national categories. There's no such thing as the French essay or the English essay or the 19th century essay, although these tags fit perfectly well the novel or even poetry. So this resistance to cultural appropriation maybe is one of the reasons that the essay has been embraced by the vernacular traditions in India, whereas it has been neglected consistently by the mainstream and by the purveyors of world literature. So without wasting any more time, I think It's over to you, Mr. Nayak.
Thank you, Mr. Gill, for your kind words, and how I wish I chaired the session and you spoke on the essay, as you made such perceptive comments. That it's a daunting privilege. At the outset, I express my deep indebtedness to the Center for the Creative and the Critical, Ashoka University, and Professor Amit Chaudhary for giving me this opportunity to share my stray thoughts with such distinguished scholars on a subject about which I know so little. In fact, in 2017, The Telegraph sent me a copy of Literary Activism edited by Amit and asked me to review it for the paper. There are too many distractions, and I thought I wasn't well equipped academically to say anything interesting on this very important subject explored in the book. So the review didn't get written. Going through the volume, I now feel that I had denied myself a wonderful opportunity to look at the business of literary criticism, the place of the humanities in the university today, and ways in which the market reshapes our understanding of literature. The book presents to me a whole new way of thinking about literature and doing literary criticism. The essays included in the volume put questions exercising our minds today in illuminating perspectives. We live in a world where criticism has been relentlessly professionalized, leaving little or no room for the inspired amateur. Professor Saikat Mojumdar's insightful essay on Neeraj C. Chaudhary and our ambivalent response to him brought back memories of my meeting him at his Oxford house way back in 1984. When we bemoaned pervasive cultural decay, he gently reminded us that Odias and Biharis shouldn't bother because they had no culture to lose anyway. Professor Swapan Chakrabarty's fascinating essay tells me how literature can be active in unsuspected, mysterious ways. The instances he examines gave me a few ideas about how to talk about forms of literary activism in 19th century Odisha. I also learned a great deal from Professor Rasinka Chaudhary's paper on literary modernism in Bengal. That we shouldn't, and her observation that we shouldn't always think of Europe as the source of modernism. I must begin by saying that the Odishan context is not very familiar to many. It was something like a backwater during colonial rule and, and lived in the shadow of Bengal. It didn't have a metropolis like Kolkata. In fact, even in the middle of the 19th century, Odias aspiring to receive college education had to travel for more than 20 days through perilous tracts to Kolkata. For a predominantly agrarian place like Odisha, it wasn't a separate province yet. Kolkata was its window on the world, a theater where people from a backward place could encounter modernity in its many guises, pleasant or unsettling. The first government college came into being in 1868 after a devastating famine ravaged Odisha in 1866, 65 years after it came under British rule. Print arrived in Odisha through missionaries in 1837. But the printed book was associated with Christian missionaries, and children were scared of touching it for fear of losing caste. Palm leaf manuscripts possessed an aroma of sanctity, for people thought Goddess Saraswati sat and inscribed palm leaves and made them a little heavier than paper made by modern machinery. It took decades for custom-ridden, caste-bound Odia middle class to overcome an initial resistance to print. The publication of the Odia weekly Utkal Deepika, brought out by a group of English-educated Odias, therefore, marks a crucial turning point in the history of Odisha and the story of its encounter with modernity or colonial modernity. Fear of print soon gave way to intense fascination with it. Brahmins brought palm leaf pothis to a printing press in Cuttack and placed them on printing machines in the hope that these would be instantly transformed into printed books. I mention all this in order to emphasize the distinction between the context of colonial Bengal and that of Odisha. Given its distance from the metropolitan center, the slow pace of the spread of English education and print culture, its limited communication with the world outside, the emerging Odia middle class had to negotiate modernity in very different ways. The encounter with modernity created new anxieties and new opportunities and led them to craft new strategies, which included literary activism of a very special kind. I have been introduced as a translator, and for a fleeting while, I flattered myself with the thought that I might be a literary activist, but I realized that I am an accidental translator and no activist. The books I have furnish me with useful examples which might help me to illustrate my points. In 19th century Odisha, the new world presented itself through a new system of dispensing justice, new administrative arrangements, new economic policies, and a new education system. The encounter with these was experienced as a series of unsettling displacements. That colonial encounter led to the introduction of literary forms like the novel has already been mentioned by some of the distinguished participants in this seminar. I will draw your attention to a few Odia novels published in the late 19th and 20th centuries to show how they dramatize these displacements. The narrative of the first full-length Odia novel, published in 1881, Padmamali, begins in a temple but ends in a law court presided over by a British judge. Serialized in, serialized in 1897 and published in 1902 in book form.
Jatin, Jatin, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
Is it possible to put the camera or whatever it is you're using on a something stable?
Oh my! Let me see if that's possible, or let me hold it in my hand. So, is it better now?
It is. It's not shaking anymore because
Okay.
it kind of it's moving and then your face is getting cut off.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, it's all right. And published in 1902 in book form, Fakir Mohan Senapati's 6 Acres and a Third poignantly dramatized these momentous shifts brought about by the colonial dispensation. One of the chapter epigraphs runs as follows: Banijye Basate Lakshmi, Tadardho BL Pass. This roughly translates as commerce brings prosperity. Passing a law degree brings you half of that prosperity. The original Sanskrit sloka runs like this.
Professor, you're muted.
You've gone mute, Jatin. Aditya,
I hope, yeah. Okay, yeah, Professor has heard us. Yeah.
And has been replaced by the profession of law and by people who are adept at manipulating. In the novel, the traditional landowning aristocracy loses out a Muslim trader to a Muslim trader, a moneylender, and finally to an English-educated lawyer. Let me now turn to another Odia novel I translated into English, which provides a helpful point of entry into the discussion of various kinds of displacement I'm talking about. The Odia title of the novel, published in the 1990s, can be translated roughly as Place, Time, Person, Desa, Kala, Patra. However, I translated it into A Time Elsewhere, which echoes Coriolano's statement there is a world elsewhere. Interestingly, there is no plot or central character in the novel. It's based on painstakingly accessed archival sources. Its real protagonist is a period of rapid change in the history of 19th century Odisha. It shows how members of the traditional elite, whose authority was based on birth, heredity, and custom, got pushed to the margin by the British after an abortive rebellion in 1817. In fact, one of the central events unfolding in the novel is the deportation of the Gajapati king of Odisha, considered a living representative of Lord Jagannath, to the Andamans after he is convicted of murder in a colonial law court. This vacuum, created by the marginalization of the traditional elite, comes to be filled by literary activists. They happen to be school teachers, lawyers, school inspectors, clerks, and educated amateurs. They enthusiastically embrace print culture, create a public sphere in which matters considered urgent from a social and cultural point of view are energetically debated. They seek the patronage of the colonial masters and collaborate with missionaries whenever they think such collaboration enriches their culture, own culture. But it would be wrong to suppose that they were servile, submissive, or mere imitators. In a courtroom scene in 6 Acres and a Third, a British witness is introduced as ABCD Douglas, and his father's name is given as EFGS Douglas. In a celebrated poem, I am returning from the marketplace, Fakir Mohan Senapati presents the whole colonial education system as a market where knowledge is sold like commodities. This cold, undazzled response to colonial forms of knowledge, coming as it does from someone who had received very little by way of formal education, strikes one as very remarkable. Fakir Mohan reminds one of the penetrating portrait vividly painted by Professor Saikat Majumdar. Like Chaudhuri, Fakir Mohan is an impassioned autodidact, an admirer of the empire, a polyglot. But unlike Chaudhuri, his admiration for the empire doesn't blind him to its capacity for destruction of so much that was valuable in his own world. The literary activism of the emerging Odia elite was animated by two objectives. That closely related to each other. They wished to usher in a kind of modernity through a new kind of literature that differed fundamentally from traditional Odia literature. They wanted this literature to contribute to the building of a new identity that would eventually find expression in the formation of the province of Odisha in 1936 on the basis of language. Odisha, along with Sindh, was the first provinces to be formed on the basis of language way back in 1936. I have already pointed out that opportunities for providing college education didn't exist until 1868. And even then, the college was actually a collegiate school. It grew into a degree college in 1875. The contrast with Bengal can't be starker. The printing presses had already created a space for literary criticism, which had its beginning in book reviews. They started discouraging Odias from acquiring palm leaf manuscripts, arguing that these were more expensive than printed books and that they were often peppered with obscenities. A shift in aesthetic sensibility can thus be traced here, and under the influence of puritanical Brahmos, members of the new elite begin to frown upon traditional Odia literature. The market for printed books expanded with the establishment of schools providing English education. Textbooks had to be written in large numbers. It's noteworthy that most of our major Odia authors in the 19th century were textbook writers, and some of them made a lot of money doing so and got involved in scandals. Some of them are school teachers and school inspectors. They included two major poets, Radhanath Rai and Madhusudan Rao, one a domiciled Bengali and the other the son of a domiciled Maratha, who sought to introduce modernity in Odia poetry by moving it closer to Western literary models and observing new forms and techniques. His constant powerful official positions in the Department of Education, they made a concerted effort to train a generation of school students in appreciating and interpreting modern Odia literature. They encouraged the compilation of model questions on literature. These questions reveal a conscious attempt to reduce the importance of teaching grammar in literature with a view to emphasizing the literariness of the literary text. Attention was increasingly directed at the content of a literary work. After 1868, textbooks of literature acquired a vibrant new dimension as emphasis shifted to writing essays, learning grammar, and dividing literature into poetry and prose. Essays, it's argued, provided students access to a Western worldview. A collection of essays titled Prabandhamala, written by Madhusudan Rao, who has been mentioned earlier, for school students, came to be published in 1880 and was prescribed for school students. Its publication constitutes a significant moment in the history of literary activism in Odisha. The essays offered a more inclusive view of literature. In fact, they redefine literature and ascribe it roles and responsibilities considered alien to it earlier. I quote from Radhanath Rai's review of the essay collection published in 1880. I quote, "This book, Prabandhamala, consists of essays on history, politics, psychology, physical sciences, geography, biography, Navanyasa, novels." He uses this expression, Navanyasa, for novels. These days, Upanyasa is more accepted. Alankar, etc. Many educated people in this country treat literature as a subject distinct from the ones mentioned above. The anemic condition of our literature is a result of such a narrow outlook. With the advancement of Odia language, these parochial ideas will be dispelled, and Odia literature will gradually move beyond the world of imagination towards the realm of knowledge and truth. One can discern the outline of an ambitious program here, a program that was to be implemented by the essay as a literary form. It may be mentioned here that this form itself was borrowed from the West and adapted to the peculiar needs of a society trying to negotiate modernity on its own terms, however, not always successfully. This essay, the essay is looked upon as a means of taking literature away from the world of imagination towards a realm of knowledge and truth. It's expected to liberate Odias from their parochial, non-modern outlook on life and enable them to observe a cosmopolitan perspective on life. It's promoted not as a means of self-exploration as in Montaigne, or aphoristic unsystematic inquiry into moral or political issues as in Bacon, but as vehicles of knowledge, a powerful pedagogic tool. One of the essays included in Prabandhamala undertakes a comparison between the Ramayana and the Iliad. And the questions on these were asked to students appearing at school examinations. Compare Iliad with the Ramayana. And another gives biographical information on Napoleon. This is again strange in the 1880s. An essay on Napoleon, his life, and not very critical account of his life. So that was quite bold. Translation plays a key role in this instance of activism. 5 out of the 21 essays featured here are Odia translations or adaptations of English essays, the titles of which are mentioned in a footnote. A story carrying a heavy moral message is included, and a travel essay containing an element of subjectivity is featured. But all the rest of the essays seek to convey new knowledge and reflection on the right conduct. The essay comes to occupy a prominent role in the identity building initiative, which also prizes the absorption of new knowledge available in metropolitan centers. In fact, one of a critique, a famous Odia critic, Notabara Samantara, says that when the railways linked Odisha with Calcutta, the great storehouse of knowledge available in Bengal became available to Odias. So this link between railways and knowledge transmission, knowledge dissemination with improved communication was grasped. This link was grasped by social historians of Odia literature. Radhanath Rai's attempt to redefine literature finds an eloquent echo in an essay stating the editorial principle of or policies of Utkal Deepika, a literary magazine that sought to transform literature into a vehicle of knowledge, an instrument of reform, and a means of consolidating Odia identity by infusing it with a cosmopolitan vision. The essay, however, has lost much of its energy and vitality once the process of academization set in and the identity building project lost its relevance after 1936. But that's another story and requires a better storyteller to be told. I have rambled long enough already, and I would very much like observations and comments which would deepen my own understanding of literary activism. I hope against hope that I'll be able to answer questions if there are any. Thank you once more for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Nayak, for this insightful and illuminating talk. To begin with, just to clarify that point about Saikat Majumdar's essay on that Ms. Nayak mentioned on Chaudhary. The Chaudhary in question is Neeraj C. Chaudhary and not Amit Chaudhary. And there's no relation between the two. Yeah. So, yeah. So if anyone has any questions, let me know. Please write in the chat or raise your hand. And I'll begin with one thing that I'm curious about. You talked about the Odia writers translating essays from English. So I'm wondering if they had any Western models in mind. Who were the essayists that they were translating?
Well, they were not very well-known essayists. I think their whole attitude towards translating essays in English was very pragmatic. As I told you, the essay wasn't really imported into Odia literature as not the classical essays by Montaigne or Bacon or great essayists of the West. Essay was actually used as a pedagogic tool and to disseminate knowledge about science, knowledge about famous people in the West, primarily science. I think, for instance, the immensity of the universe, for about the printing press. So they were actually desperate to disseminate a kind of knowledge that traditional literature wasn't dispensing or conveying to students. So they were worried about their narrow parochial outlook and their obsession with form, literary form, music.
I think he dropped off, or did I?
No, you're here, Vineet. I think there's an internet outage, I think.
Yeah, there's something.
Nayak.
Vineet, he invited you to switch places with him anyway. So do you want to kind of, do you have any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts. So many questions. I was just wondering about the attitude towards the essay in India in in Bengali literature.
He's back.
He's back. Okay.
Why don't you add this as a question or what you were saying? But I think Jatin was going to finish.
Yeah, Ms. Nayak, please.
You're on mute, Jatin. We can't hear you.
I've asked Professor to unmute. I guess
you need to unmute.
You're on mute.
Okay.
Yeah, he's on mute.
So am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So all I was trying to say is that the essay was incorporated or was introduced into Odia literature as a vehicle of knowledge, information, and this knowledge was supposed to be available in the West, but the attitude was far from submissive, and a comparative perspective was deliberately brought in, like I refer to the essay comparing the Iliad with the Ramayana and discussing the relative merits. So this comparative perspective prevented a very submissive or servile attitude from creeping into their essays. So that's how I would look at it.
Right. So Biswamit has submitted a question which relates to the point I was trying to make earlier. So he says, I would love to know examples of cross-genre essays in Odia literature, which included maybe poetic or fictional techniques, and if there were any prominent female essayists in Odia.
Oh, I think you mentioned the critical discourse in Odia, which is actually a translation of 25 critical essays spanning a period of 150 years. So very few women essayists and lots of amateurs. In fact, as I told you, the academization of essay was a kiss of death. Most of our great essayists were novelists themselves or writers themselves and amateurs, inspired amateurs. So once the academy moved in and essay got academized, got written for promotions and career advancement, I think it lost its energy and vitality, and very few women writers, and about crossing or mixing genres. Whenever I write, I think novelists write essays. Even in this collection published in 1880, there is one travel essay where he's talking about the essayist is bringing his own subjectivity into the essay, refers to himself, his own emotions, his own experience of wonder, but they try to keep these out as far as possible and make the essay. And there is also a short story in this essay, a kind of moral fable about the dangers of becoming arrogant, expressing pride. Apart from that, I think the 19 essays are all about knowledge, all about scientific information, biography, geography. So they perceived a lack, an absence in the public sphere, in the educational world, and tried to supply this lack through as much knowledge as they could get from what they considered to be the modern Western world. But at the same time, always presenting things on their own terms. I gave you the example of Fakir-Mohn Senapati presenting the colonial education system as a marketplace. He said certain forms of knowledge are more sellable than other forms of knowledge. He's not overwhelmed by it. That's why I brought the comparison between Literacy Chaudhary was overwhelmed by the West. And here is someone who is an autodidact, received very little formal education, is not overwhelmed by it. He can maintain a critical stance towards Western knowledge, saying that it's backed by colonial power. Therefore, everybody goes to that teacher who is wearing suits and abandoning or ignoring or neglecting the poor Avadhan who is wearing a dhoti. And they're neglecting very valuable forms of knowledge. So that's how he looked at it, even in the 19th century.
Right.
I hope that.
Anant Giri has a question. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Professor Nayak and Mr. Gill and all friends co-present. Thank you for a very fascinating critical journey with literature and history. But beginning a critical clue from your last sentence that Fakir-Mohn was not overwhelmed by colonial knowledge. Similarly, now people of 19th century Odisha, many of them may not also have been overwhelmed by the primacy of the colonial metropolis, that the picture that you are presenting. Because this is also a colonial picture. You know, if we look into the self-formation, now the people who lived that time, all of them were not slavish, you know, they were not comparing themselves to the colonial colonization and the primacy of Bengal. And, you know, because Odisha also had multiple Odisha. And your story presents a Bengal-linked Odisha. My query is that once we come to South, for example, there is also a Telugu regional dimension. And in Western Odisha, Hindi regional dimension. How the portrait of Odisha literature would arise if you also bring this diversity of regionalization. And my other quick query is that, no, I think these are the two things that I wish to submit to you, please.
Thank you, Professor Giri, for those very perceptive comments. My focus was on the advent of print culture in Cuttack, in coastal Odisha, and the negotiation with the metropolis that was located in Bengal, because all the early pioneers of whatever the Odia, the regeneration that we associate with the mid-19th century, like Gaurisankar Rai, Radhanath Rai, Madhus, almost all of them received education in Kolkata or were exposed to. And Bengal was the inescapable referent. Whereas the Barampur or Ganjam was part of Madras presidency, and the negotiation with Telugu culture and all that wasn't as vigorous. We have people like Samsundar Rajguru, Gopinath Nanda Sarma, a couple. But if you look at the negotiation with I never suggested that it was a slavish relationship, but it was an inescapable referent. I recently wrote a piece on image of Kolkata in Odia autobiographies. There are some 40 Odia autobiographies which give us pictures of, accounts of Odias interacting with the colonial metropolis in different ways. We do not have a similar intense engagement with any other metropolis. So, for instance, we never had that kind of intense engagement with the Madras in the south of Odisha, or with any other metropolis in the north of Odisha. So, obviously, this is the inescapable referent. And the Odia nationalism the identity building initiative that I was talking about was directed largely against Bengali domination. That's why I mentioned that this is the inescapable referent. And but there is always this anxiety about any identity building initiative that it can grow very narrow-minded. That's why even Radhanath Rai is talking about parochialism. So the desire to define Odisha through a linguistic identity, at the same time to allay anxieties relating to becoming parochial. So the desire for a cosmopolitan worldview and the need for local habitation and name, and need for a province based on Odisha's linguistic identity. So there was always a very productive tension between the two. And it's very interesting that in 1936, when Odisha becomes a separate province, it gets granted the status of a separate province, the communists bring about a journal, a literary journal called Adhunik, and it had nothing to do with Odia identity. So this tension is very, very productive. And essay was a vehicle through which this cosmopolitan outlook, this reformist outlook, this engagement with the West could be best expressed. That's how I would look at it.
I also wanted to know, we do have time, Amit.
Maybe for one more question.
If you have any questions, comments?
No, please go ahead. You wanted to ask.
I wanted to ask about travel writing in Odia, whether there was any real tradition of travel literature in Odia writing. In Hindi, for instance, we didn't have anything until quite late with Rahul Sanktai and maybe Nirmal Verma in the 60s and 70s. So what about Odia?
I think, again, travel writing began striking roots in the periodical literature. In 1897, I think people start traveling through Odisha. and then leave accounts of these in periodicals, and then they start moving outside Odisha. For instance, Sasibhushan Rai, who is the son of Radhanath Rai, one of the greatest modern Odia poets who died in 1908, he wrote a travel narrative titled Dakhinatya Jatra, Travel to the South. Then the adopted daughter of Madhusudan Das, the architect chief, one of the chief architects of modern Odisha, went to Britain to receive education in a college in Cambridge, not the Cambridge University, but a teacher's education college in Cambridge. So she also left accounts of her travel writing. So as the century, as we move into the 20th century, we have a vigorous tradition of quite vibrant tradition of travel writing about people going to different parts of India and then abroad. Lots of travel narratives relating to people going to Britain to receive higher education. So nearly 30, 40 accounts are available. And that's how I think writing took shape. But that's again part of, can be seen as part of the colonial encounter, and travel essay also became quite popular. So essay also served travel writing in a significant way. I mentioned one such in 1880 in this book, where the author himself undertakes a journey to a part of India and leaves a very emotionally charged account of that, his sense of wonder. And even in Fakir Mohan's autobiography, you'll find his journey to Vizag to attend a conference of the Congress, a session of the Congress, where he meets Lokmanya Tilak. And so travel writing was slowly making its presence felt. And later it established itself as a very popular genre.
Right. So great. Thank you for this. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.